Welcome, everyone. I'm going to give folks just a couple more minutes to come into the room before we start. But in the meantime, it's so good to see all of your names. Welcome to ARI Week 2021. Okay, so for those of you just arriving, we're going to give it a couple more minutes to allow some more of our folks to get here before we get started. Already seeing so many wonderful names. Welcome, everyone. Ooh, folks are still coming in. I'll give it just a couple more minutes, another minute or so before we get started. Oh, I'm so excited to see everyone. We made it. ARI 2021 is here. Okay. Looks like the sort of mad rush of folks entering the waiting room has started to slow. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I want to note what you're seeing on your screen, that our keynote this morning is being, well, it's morning for me. Our keynote today is being sponsored by the University of Toronto's Faculty of Information and University College London's Information Studies program. Okay, so apologies for the fuzziness of my screen. It is because it's so early here in Hawaii that the light is still, the sun is still coming up, so the lighting here is a little strange. Okay, I'm Tanya Sutherland. For those of you who are in the room that I do not know, I'd like to welcome you to the first keynote of ARI 2021. It is my absolute pleasure and delight to introduce today's keynote speaker. I'd like to start with a brief land acknowledgement and say that I am joining you from Honolulu, Hawaii, which is the unceded Aina, or land of the Kanaka Maoli, or Native Hawaiian people. I am here as an uninvited guest and visitor, where I've lived for the past 3 years on the island of Oahu. Okay. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and move forward and introduce today's keynote. I'm so excited. Dr. Stanley H. Griffin holds a bachelor with honors in history and a PhD in cultural studies with high commendation from the Cave Hill, Barbados campus of the University of the West Indies. He also holds an MSc in Archives and Records Management from the University of Dundee in Scotland. Stanley was formerly the Archivist-in-Charge of the UE Archives. He is now lecturer in archival studies and coordinates the graduate program in Archives and Records Management in the Department of Library and Information Studies at the University of West Indies, UWI's Mona campus in Jamaica. Stanley's research interests, Dr. Griffin's research interests, include multiculturalism in Antigua and the Eastern Caribbean, the cultural dynamics of intra-Caribbean migrations, archives and the constructs of Caribbean culture, and community archives in the Caribbean. His most recent publications include Decolonizing the Caribbean Record, an archives reader. If you haven't had a chance to check out that book yet, it's really fantastic. I could not recommend it more highly. It was co-edited with our own Jeannette Bastian and also John Ahrens. Several book chapters, Dr. Griffin has put out several book chapters, including Archival Silences, Missing, Lost, and Uncreated Archives, and journal articles, including in the Journal of Popular Culture, the International Journal of Information, Diversity, and Inclusion, and the Journal of West Indian Literature. Although I was told not to say this, I will say that to my mind, Stanley is the leading Caribbean, leading archival scholar in the Caribbean. He is certainly the lone Caribbean-based voice, hoping to raise our own homegrown core of professionals and thinkers, competent and confident to take our rightful place as Caribbean scholars and archivists in the archival world. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Stanley Griffin. Please join me in welcoming him, and welcome again everyone to ARI 2021. Stanley, what a pleasure.
Thanks,
Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for your kind words of introduction, and good morning, good day to everyone. I'm Stanley Griffin, and I want us to focus for the next few minutes. I was told 40 minutes, so for the next few minutes, I want us to think about archival studies, archival work in the Caribbean. And so the title is, if I could get these things off the screen, is Where Records Dance, Sing and Talk, Exploring Caribbean Record Forms and Archival Studies. So before I get started, I want to do a quick land acknowledgement. If I could get the thing off the screen here. So I live on the island of Examaka, the land of wood and water, part of the island networks of homelands for the Taino people whose presence though diminished by the efforts and experiences of Spanish and British colonialism, is still very much alive and vibrant here in the island now named Jamaica. I also acknowledge that I live, study, and teach on the Mona campus as pictured of the University of the West Indies. The former Mona and Papine sugar plantations where enslaved Africans, indentured in East Indians, and Europeans, as well as imprisoned Gibraltarian evacuees and Jewish refugees in the Second World War, labored and built the campus society in which I, a descendant of formerly enslaved Caribbean workers, can achieve what they could only dream of. As a Caribbean archivist, cultural analyst, here we are. As a Caribbean archivist, cultural analyst, and historian, I endeavor to affirm and tell the stories of how the indigenous, the emancipated, the formerly indentured, and colonial settlers were resilient in shaping the out of many one people, that is today's Jamaica and the Caribbean. So, I want us to do four things in the time allotted. I want us to think about what Caribbean record forms are, and I will be using the creativity that came out over the last few months with the pandemic for us to think through some of the issues that we're going to be considering today. I want us to think about Caribbean record forms, thinking about the history, thinking about records, and then what is considered archival versus cultural within the Caribbean context. There is a major split to this day between how memory is expressed and memory is considered cultural versus quote unquote the archive, the place, the materials, the process. And so if there is a thing called Caribbean archival, if the Caribbean has its own ways of expressing and keeping and preserving the materials of memory, what will that look like for a discipline in the Caribbean? What is there a Caribbean archival studies? So hopefully in the next few minutes, we get a quick snapshot of the place in where I work, I live, and what I basically teach in the 3 programs that we have here at the University of the West Indies in the Department of Library and Information Studies. I want us to begin with a brief, very quick history of the Caribbean. Very quick history of the Caribbean. And I want us to think of how our society started and the ways in which our record keeping followed that historical narrative. So for those of you who are not fully aware, here is the Caribbean, or the Caribbean. And when Christopher Columbus, if you could see my cursor, when Christopher Columbus came, showed up, made his entry, he started in the northern section there. For those of you who know that tip of Florida, coming all the way down to the south. So there's an island chain with Cuba, the Bahamas, Cuba, Jamaica, Haiti, Puerto Rico, a chain of islands heading all the way down to South America. And that green territory is the only English-speaking territory in Central America, referred to as Belize, or formerly British Honduras. While I'm thinking about the Caribbean this morning, I'm going to be focusing on the English-speaking colonial experience, with perhaps a bit of reference to the French. That is not to say that the Spanish Caribbean or the Dutch Caribbean and in parts of the Virgin Islands, the Danish experience is not of equal merit for discussion. So I will be focusing on the British experience. And so when the Europeans came and landed, the Spanish took over the first 4 major islands there, the Greater Antilles that it is referred to, the Cuba, the Jamaica, the Hispaniola, which is now divided between Haiti, the French-speaking, and the Dominican Republic, Spanish-speaking, and Puerto Rico. While the British, when they landed in St. Kitts, Nevis, and they made their way down along with the French. Really and truly, the Caribbean was never designed to be a society, right? When the Caribbean was founded, it was about work. You either came here to work or you came here to get rich off of somebody else's work. And so I like to make reference to this quote by a male enslaved African who is quoted as saying, "The devil was in the Englishman." The devil was in the Englishman because he made everything work. The entire geography, the entire topography, the entire island, the entire space was used in the production of a monocultural product. In most of the Caribbean, that would have been sugar. In other places like Belize, it would have been mahogany, or the Bahamas, salt, and so forth. So everything worked. The enslaved work, the horse work, the donkeys work, the wood work, the water, the wind work. And in this scene, you're basically getting a snapshot of the entire design of the plantation. Now, the plantation was essential for understanding the Caribbean because it still shaped how our society is structured to this day, right? A lot of our issues, isms, realities, experiences came out of the plantation experience that is particular or peculiar to the territory that you're focusing on. Here's an image of Curaçao, Willemstad, which was colonized by the Dutch. And if you know your Dutch landscapes very well, that city literally mirrors the landscape of Amsterdam in Holland, in the Netherlands. So we are very much, another theory says, mimic. You were created to work for the production, the benefit, the enrichment of the colonizing territories. Now, Sylvia Winter goes even further. She argued that the Caribbean societies were not just about building plantations within the soil, within the topography, within the geography of the space, but the peoples that were planted were also part of this structure, right? People came, people were brought, people were indentured, people were enslaved to work on the plantation. And so the society, the grouping, the ways in which our nationhood was developed was part of this plantation, this bringing together of various persons from around the world. So in this image, you're seeing the those indentured from India, the British colony of India, brought in after emancipation, starting in 1848 in larger territories to replace, quote unquote, the formerly enslaved, the now emancipated African workers. Coming out of that then, Antonio Benitez, who is into literature and culture, he argues that the Caribbean plantation was tense. It brought all these various cultures, all these various peoples, all these various, and placed them within all these various hierarchies, right? All these various ranking systems. And so out of this volcano, he argues, is this eruption, this constant creativity, this constant coming together, repelling apart to form a dance step, a language, the line of a poem, and so on and so on. And I want to stop right there, and we're going to move straight into what was taking place over the last few months with respect to the ways in which our society has been documenting, has been memorializing, has been communicating, has been discussing the corona pandemic. So here's this quick cartoon that I will not be using, but this came out of St. Lucia. And it created this whole discussion about how corona is being perceived within the St. Lucian environment. So in terms of creating records, in terms of documenting the here and now, there are two ways. And for the first time, I'm pushing that the digital smartphone technology was major, perhaps for the first time in the way it has been used and propagated. And they've used their smartphones to do animation, to do as I refer to as digital storytelling, which comes out of our traditional ways of telling stories by recording spontaneous conversations, reactions, and going live, right? In addition to having stage performances, doing dances, and adhering to participating in the various quote-unquote challenges, and constructing tweets and memes. We're going to look at some of these expressions, these dances, songs, and talks, storytelling. And as I argued, these traditional forms, for the first time in a real serious, concentrated way, were not created and maintained, used, indulged in particular spaces, as is the traditional, where you do your storytelling, you sing your calypsos, you sing your songs as part of a festival or a carnival, or as part of a season. For example, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, it's Christmas time, or St. Kitts around that Christmas time toward Trinidad and Tobago, Antigua, the carnival, right? Because COVID took over every sphere of life and restricted this need to communicate, this need to share, created an out-of-season response, an out-of-season creativity. And so this was also done in terms of signs and adverts and news alerts, where what the linguists now refer to as our home languages as opposed to dialects or patois, and we're going to see some of that in the few videos that we will be looking at, as well as dance and so forth. So in other words, the traditional moved into the digital, or the digital moved into the traditional in order to communicate and share. And it's important that we think about this, because this move to the digital from the traditional is forcing us in the Caribbean as archivists and heritage people, records managers, to think about the ways in which we are now preserving quote unquote culture, right? So here we go. We're gonna start off with some calypsos. A calypso is a song, usually a storytelling, a way of sharing information. And it usually comes out of the competitions. They're usually calypso competitions. So the guy who's singing, King Socrates, is a winner of the 2019 version of the carnival. And he sang a song about St. Kitts. I'm only playing extracts, not the full song. All the clips are from YouTube, so feel free to search thereafter if you're so inclined. All right, so here we go, the first presentation, Calypso, This Too Shall Pass. Oops.
This is King Socrates, reigning Calypso monarch of St. Kitts and Nevis, paying tributes to first responders the world over on the battlefield of COVID-19. To all those affected by the virus, know that this too shall pass. From global depopulation, conspiracies, to the declaration of the end times, prophecies, to biological warfare, rumors spreading everywhere as to what is the real cause of the virus. But to contain the spread, we must cooperate with the steps the authorities said to take. With each and everyone playing his part, Corona can't last. Like this Spanish flu that killed 2 million in 1918, this too shall pass. Though the death toll keep rising with COVID-19, this too shall pass. About every 100 years, we get a pandemic that appears to be apocalyptic. Though no one knows how long it will last, this too shall pass. This too shall pass.
All right, that's the first one. And then we move to Jamaica. And we have two young people to school, they're in sixth form. That's basically, I think that's your uniform. And they did a TikTok video based on using Jamaican musical genres, dancehall mostly. Just thinking about COVID. Here you go. Oops.
The place they pan lockdown, nobody can go nowhere. Turn your yard that the hashtag a trend, yeah. Remember if you wash your two hand them proper, yeah, hear me? Ready up, listen and follow me there. Me go so ropes, soap, water, wash it, sod, scrub, rinse it, flash it, finger, hand back, water, got it, pat dry, napkin, germs dead, stop it. 99.9% of germs them gone. Have me sanitizer. Me hear a youth talk about him no afraid of the virus, but me a the wiser. Lockdown, sanitizer turn up. A board in the house, me see a tree, me a go run up. Cool in me chest, if me no coughing, I go come up. Can't cough too loud, that's the violence I go turn up. Lock your door, stay easy. You no hear me? Handshake, physical contact, scary. Flu-like symptoms, nobody come near me. Self-isolate, give me distance, clear me. 99.9% of germs them gone. Have me sanitizer. Me hear a youth talk about him.
All right. And then we go to Extempo out of the Commonwealth of Dominica. Extempo is usually an on-the-spot storytelling, usually happening in what is referred to as tents, or very informal. So like a setting like this, I would pull out a guitar and start to sing. There was a calypso challenge where a rhythm, the melody you'll hear, or the track you'll hear in the background, was circulated around the Eastern Caribbean. And this is one of my favorites, so you'll have a listen. I think Ophelia is a calypsonian, professional calypsonian out of Dominica. So enjoy.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Ay, ay, ay. This is me, your mama Creole, with a message for big and small. Positivity is a must. We're gonna beat the coronavirus. Let's put blows on COVID-19. We're washing hands and we're staying clean. Senior citizens don't need no stress. We'll recover from this duress. Boy. Some of you say we like too much fat, and you never see we praying yet. Wait, when the quarantine is all done, we go praise and party as one. We'll enjoy the sweet calypso, cadence and bouillon for so. Stay safe, you're not Dominica. This is your lady of song, Ophelia, boy.
And I hope you're capturing the stories, the issues, the underlying stories that are happening in these songs. Now we move to talk, where we share stories, we give instructions in our our unique way of doing that. So we have this young fellow from Jamaica, and here's a quick enjoy.
You listen to me. You better get your jacket, your gloves, pack all of your things, them. Yes, I'm not gonna joke, so I'm not gonna laugh. Pack up all of your things and put your mattress on your head top, your foot in your hand, and run. Cause Corona there Jamaica. Corona there Jamaica. Just reach a Kingston. I'm not lie. So, I'm gonna pack up and sit there and meet me. Meet me a country, all the way I run. I run to China. Alright, big woman thing. Corona Day at Jamaica, guys. Alright, I'm talking straight. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Orion Rose. I'm from YouTube, and I'm telling you guys that Corona has just arrived at Jamaica in Kingston. A lady from the UK, bring it come here. Yes, so pack up your things, put your mattress on your head, grab all your clothes, and let's run. Corona is in Jamaica. Yes. Yeah, so I'm here. Corona is in Jamaica, so we have to be careful. I don't make nobody cough pound or nothing. If you see somebody a cough, you say, move! Yo, my God.
So he quickly is telling the story of how the corona virus arrived in Jamaica. When the whole thing started, it was a big joke. And so there was lots of, this thing can't be real and so on and so forth, until a Jamaican returning home from the UK for a funeral came, was feeling ill, hugged up everybody at the funeral, and then it spread on island. And so in another island, the Prime Minister was also sharing and giving instructions about how to deal with the, social distance. Enjoy.
But the stay home, the stop moving statements that I made, I will continue to make them, and I will ask everybody to continue to make them. If you must speak to your neighbor over the fence, keep a 2-meter distance from your neighbor in case he coughs. And if he coughs, run.
Big boss, on the road.
If you must speak to your neighbor over the fence, keep a 2-meter distance. Keep a 2-meter distance. If you must speak to your neighbor over the fence, keep a 2-meter distance. Keep a 2-meter distance. Keep a 2-meter distance from your neighbor in case he coughs. Keep a 2-meter distance from your neighbor in case he coughs. Keep a 2-meter distance from your neighbor in case he coughs. Keep a 2-meter distance, and if he coughs, run.
Big boss,
Run.
on the road.
Run. And if he coughs, run.
Stop moving.
Stop! But officer going up by crackers and sardines. Look my papers. Hey, rustig, okay? Stop, huh? You don't hear the prime minister say stop, you must stop, okay? Where you going? Sardines. Everybody want to eat crackers and sardines.
And if he coughs, run.
All right. And so there's the talk, and then the Jerusalem challenge was also, participated, but folks participated here in the island. So here's Antigua and Barbados.
Jerusalem, ikayalami, ilondoloze, uhambe nami, zungangishilana. Jerusalem, ikayalami, ilondoloze, uhambe nami, zungangishilana. Dawo yami ayikholana, buso wami awukholana. Ilondoloze, zuhambe nami. Dawo yami ayikholana, buso wami awukholana. Ilondoloze,
Right, and there's another dance. I think this is the final one.
Hey yo, Corona. No, I did not say Verona. Needless Corolla or Toyota. Even though we know some of them don't give a iota. Watch me no one pan one now. Watch me no one pan one now. You put your right foot in, you put your left foot in. You touch it all about this is the new in thing. No more handshake, we not partake. Because Corona a rock like a earthquake. Put your elbow in and do some elbow touching. And this me I tell you, cut out the hugging. And this is when me hear, and it get me scared. Even though you have your lover, watch how you draw near. Where the lights all there, where the wives them there. I tell you, say no left it any which part you're there. Any which part the germs and the skirmish there. Wax on, wax off, just like karate. Kidding if you're kidding, if you're kidding. But let me tell you this, no, well I not a kidding. This Corona thing, it depend on one piece of killing. Prevention is better than cure. Me yelling, you put your right foot in, you put your left foot in. You touch it all about this is the new in thing. No more handshake, we not partake. Because Corona a rock like a earthquake. Put your elbow in and do some elbow touching. And this me I tell you, cut out the hugging.
All right, so the question we have in the Caribbean is, what is the archival? What you've witnessed, those four basic, examples, we still perceive them as cultural. We don't think of them as records. Because of our colonialism, because of the way we structure the archive in the Caribbean, we still think the paper, the slave registered as example there, is the archival, is the record, while the guy knocking drum is noise. And we're going to talk about that shortly. So they're not perceived as archival. Now, in terms of the history, or record keeping history follows that of the contextual history, where because persons came to do plantation work, all our initial records are about businesses, about plantation, are about substantiating the production of plantation. And so records form part of that colonial control. If you notice, the record series at Kew Gardens National Archives in the UK, using Mandy Banton's work as representation for the Colonial Office, each territory had a direct reporting relationship to either the Crown or to a particular business, merchant banks and so forth. We did not interact with each other. We interacted straight with the metropole. And, you know, Benitez Rohe stated there in terms of a cultural reality, a Haitian or Martinican was closer to France than Jamaica. And we still have that issue today. The Puerto Rican better identifies with the US than with Suriname in the South. So we have a direct reporting relationship with the colonials, and that relationship built our archives. And so the pressures in which the society was formed shape how the record was determined, created, preserved, and also, you know, defined. So the Europeans tried to maintain power over a society that was tense, right? While the African enslaved resisted. So there was always this check and balance happening. And that took, you know, also took, was also expressed in record form, where the written was considered the record, and the records, the performances, the living, breathing memory expressions of the formerly enslaved are considered cultural. Mind you, it took us generations to reach the point where we think of these cultural ways of doing as, you know, these ways of doing as cultural. So the archives then for us is very much a part of the whole imperialism reality, is very much a part of the colonial. And as Rachel Buchanan says, one of the major issues we still have is that we think of records as written, and we think of culture as the oral, the expressed, the not as serious, not as valued as written. So what writing did was literally disrupt the ways in which we did memory, the ways in which we, you know, passed down memory, the ways in which we considered what is worthy of being preserved. In that, I say all of that to say, our archives are still very much paper-driven, paper-oriented. We are trained to manage people. We're having difficulty because of resources and mindsets trying to transition to the digital. What we have not really done was captured the cultural as archival. And so when you look at our archival history, right, starting with Jamaica, which has the oldest tradition, you know, Jenkinson, Schellenberg, they all arrived in the Caribbean. They were all here. And Clinton Black, who's our first government archivist and whose hand shaped the government archives throughout the Commonwealth Caribbean, represented that colonial construct. Let's go even further to the 1990s when we start to think of records management and records and information management. It came out of stipulations coming from the global north, treaties, aid, international law. And so once our government leaders went off and signed these arrangements, the record keeping implications created a need for records management. So if you were to look at the Jamaica archives, it is a replica of the Public Records Office in the UK, which is now the National Archives. Trinidad came out of the historical manuscript tradition, while the University of the West Indies, the history department, was really the instigator for building government archives or trying to have access to archives, documentary archives in the Eastern Caribbean. So this idea of decolonizing then, it's not just a title of the book, it's a real reality for us, right? Right now, because of the paper mandate, the paper vision of archives, there is this real need to acknowledge that the creativity of the people, of Caribbean people, really are the records, right? You know, the creativity are the records. So recently I wrote that while the colonial establishment did reports, wrote journals and observations for the marginalized masses, we sang songs, chants, danced, told stories, and had community gatherings. The creativity of the gifted singer, musician, dancer, and storyteller and community leader was central to our information creation, dissemination, and preservation as described with ink and paper. And so in the region, we're still grappling now. As an archival studies program, we're still grappling with this idea that you must preserve, you must capture, you must maintain the paper. Chances are the paper coming from above, the colonial, the government. While at the same time, there's all this creativity that's happening that we have not been able to capture. We have not, quote unquote, classified them as having archival, using a theory, a theory that one of our cultural analysts came up with, Caroline Cooper, out of literatures, where she said the written knowledge is the written word is considered knowledge, while the other, the rhythms, the songs, the movement is considered noise. And to some extent, that still happens. We still think of the paper as valid, as truth, while the other is noise and in need of verification and corroboration. So when we think of the state of Caribbean written records, and we're using Rita Pemberton's excellent chapter in the Decolonizing book as the frame or the lens to look through, 70%, and some would say higher, most of our record holdings are from the colonial time periods, right? While at the same time, we have connections overseas. They've been, so our records are distant, they're damaged, right? Because of lack of preservation, interest, and all sorts of other nice issues, deliberately destroyed or disappearing. I want to mention in terms of the title disappearing is this lack of interest because one, many archives and archivists have been accused of keeping the memory of a particular generation, a particular colonial time period that nobody wants to remember, right? There's a phrase of, that is white people thing, the European, that's a colonial history. We don't need that. And in another instance where the archivists kind of look like me, they were saying you're trying to blacken the archive, right? The users are all not persons looking like me. Chances are the users come from overseas. They come with their grants, their research grants and so forth. And so there's a real issue in terms of giving official recognition to oral traditions as archival. And so if we were to think of the Caribbean archival, I want to argue that the dance that you see, what you saw on video, in video recording in the clips, chances are is how people will remember this experience. All the movement, the songs, the stories, they will not be writing journals. They will not be, writing blogs. The songs will tell the tales, will tell the experiences of the time. And so a lot of the movement, if we were to interrogate that dance that you saw, they came from elsewhere, and Rex Suttleford argues, cultural dances, the dances that came with us, the rhythms that came over, have given enduring life sources. I love that phrase because to my mind, it sounds like the definition of a record, right? It continues to imbue, continues to refresh, continues to give life to other movements. Louise Bennett, one of our Jamaican she's a folklorist, a poet, a writer, an educator. She argued strongly that our home language is valid, it has merit. And all these various persons here, I've been quoting myself for some time now, the song and performances of the time become a record of that time. Mervyn Allen, another linguist, says the oral tradition provides different texts and volumes and experiences of the historical narrative. Richard Alsop, who wrote single-handedly our Caribbean English Usage Dictionary, says the language is the ways in which we represent and document ourselves. So how will all of that fit into an archival studies that is rooted and grounded in the Caribbean? And I want to say first and foremost right now and give due recognition to Professor Jeannette Bastian, who spearheaded the curriculum committee that met in 2013 to really shape our understanding of what Caribbean archival studies. So obviously this is our program in graphic. You'll find the fundamentals, the records and archives. You'll find the preservation issues, again, focusing on the Caribbean, focusing on our realities. So the archival preservation course focuses on the issues of trying to preserve in a tropical environment. Folks, the standards that come out of Europe don't work for us, right? The environment that is natural for the best practices for the European context cannot work for us. We need air conditioning, we're hot, we have hurricanes, right? The Meet, Sound and Vision course came out of the experiences of, she helped develop sound and visual archives programs throughout the Caribbean, coming out of radio stations, because a lot of that creativity was preserved, used and preserved on tape within the context of the broadcasting agencies. We think of advocacy, again, within our context, but that Caribbean distinctive shows itself in terms of how we look at history, how we look at our culture, and it, peaks in the course called Caribbean Memory and Record Keeping, where we look at some of the clips, some of the issues, food, landscapes, and how they actually represent the ways in which we do memory within these spaces. And so, once we have thrown all of that, all of these distinctives and these issues, these concerns, these ways of thinking. In addition to the internship, the students have a final research paper, and this is what they've come up with so far. We've had students looking at island stamps, persons looking at landscapes, another person looking at dancehall, a particular performer vibes cartel. Is music and performances as capturing our time period in Jamaica's history. We have had others look at private papers, others looking at festivals. This year, we have a person looking at the ways in which we document our dead. We have another one thinking about community descriptions, participatory descriptions for arranging, for what we call it, describing records within the National Archives, right? We think about using the archives for reinforcing and re-energizing festivals and carnivals and reenactments, right? We think of records as part of community memory and how we memorialize the tragic incidences of our time. So, the students are leaving here with this understanding, this competency, and this real appreciation that the archival is not just in paper form. The archival is literally living, breathing, and around them, right? And I want to end with this song that was commissioned, another clip from Barbados, again, trying to document the COVID realities. And in the title of that song is "This Is Who We Are," right? Our records are very much living, breathing, but sadly not within the holdings of our institutions. Our institutions are not resourced for that. When I was in the university archive system, we lost accession simply because we did not have the wherewithal to capture the living, breathing materials. And so the archival is embedded in the cultural. There is a Caribbean archival that includes the oral tradition that must be given the same kind of respect and the same kind of infrastructure for preservation as we continue to do for the written records in accordance with the colonial traditions that we have inherited. And finally, I'm hoping that in the short time, you would agree that there is a Caribbean archival studies. We have our own ways of documenting, interrogating, and giving recognition to the ways in which we do memory and record keeping in the Caribbean.
Throughout the world, it's a time that seems so dark. Inside we're closer, not apart. The sun still shines in our hearts.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Griffin. Stanley, thank you. That was amazing. That was amazing. I enjoyed your presentation so much. So I'm seeing lots of amazings and thank you, so amazing, in the chat box. And I do have one question from a member of the audience. From Shanta Smith Cruz. This was fairly early on in your presentation. I'm curious how you've come to these digital storytelling objects. Are people bringing them to you, or did you source them on your own?
Yeah, well, I no longer work in an archive, so I'm just teaching full time. So I source them on my own. The challenge really is, and I did, this comes out of a presentation I did, within our department some weeks ago, where I said, now that we're on lockdown, what does an academic do, especially a cultural studies person like me? So I started looking around and capturing what people have been creating over the COVID period. The harsh reality is, as much as all of that creativity is basically arguably within YouTube, within the public space, the harsh reality is a number or institutions are not resourced to capture. All right. We recently had a volcano in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And in speaking to the archivist there, I was like, there's all that footage happening. People are using their phones and capturing. Try and get those in the archives. And they're like, yes, we're gonna try. But then how? We don't have a server, right? We have, so the resource isn't there. And so the challenge is, if we don't change the way we define records, we're still going to perpetuate that a record has a particular form, paper, can hold in a box, can fit on a shelf. And what will happen, and it's already happening, you walk, and I've written about this in another paper, you go to the archives, you experience, you do your research, but you walk away with all these questions that remain unanswered because the corroboration, the other record, the record of the marginalized is living, it's breathing, but it's not in the repository. So that's the challenge we have as practitioners, and the challenge I think I have as a lecturer to, hey, say, oh, the calypsos, the dances, the way we do plants on land. I remember saying in a class in some parts of the Caribbean, when a child is born, a tree is planted, and a student raises his hand and said, yes, my mother has a tree, and so the ways in which we do memory will not fit on paper, will not fit in a box, and we must be deliberate in redefining ourselves. Unlike other places like the Pacific, where the Pacific made that determination some years ago, I think in the early 2000s, we in the Caribbean still haven't made those steps to define what does enduring value look like and feel like, and how is it actioned? How do we capture it, quote unquote? Is it fixable and make it shelvable and accessible within a reading room context? Is that even possible? Hopefully I've answered.
Oh, yes, definitely. Along those lines, someone else is wondering whether you have any thoughts on how to approach description or metadata, as we try to document these living forms of archives or cultural expression.
Yeah, I stress in the classroom the participatory approach, where the community needs to be involved in the documenting, and we do that in several ways. So we talk about participation. In fact, one of our students, her research paper is about that entire process, where, it's And it's a major, this idea just developed in her institution, where the project is titled Find Yourself, Find Suriname, where the community is encouraged to come in. They are, quote unquote, trained in, using the technology and so forth. And what she has found thus far is that by participating, the archivist, the archive, receives greater detail than they could ever try on their own, right? Again, a number of these initiatives that you saw is not a one-man. So the traditional ways of documenting, where the professional adds, can't work. More and more, I think the Caribbean archivist has to be a facilitator. He has to be a coordinator. He or she has to be a coordinator, right? They have to be able to allow the community to see the richness of the purposes for and the ways it enriches this greater understanding of the community, and have them document and participate in the documenting. I have found, if and when that is possible, the collection, the quote, the materials are enriched by that process and expanded. You get lots more when you stop being the professional and you be you become the facilitator, right? You enrich the process by allowing the community to speak and to be involved in the documentation.
I absolutely agree. I think that's, I think that community participation and that kind of community engagement is really the only way, because, I mean, when you're talking about living and embodied records, right, you have to sort of rely on the record creator quite a bit to maintain those records. So we have one more question in the chat. Do people have enough trust in government archives to deposit living records into them? Trust that they will be treated seriously and respectfully, that they would be preserved in their context, that they would continue having access to them?
That's a good question. Generally, there is, where you find active collecting happening. So in the same reader, there's a chapter by Margaret Thomas of St. Lucia, where the archives is involved community-wise. So she will go to the Central Park, set up scanners and tell people, go on the radio, bring this Saturday we're looking at schools, bring anything you have about schools, and the community will come with their pictures, with their school uniforms. And when there is a public interaction, that will happen. Chances are, because of our definitions of the record and record keeping, that trust is, is divided or stratified. So those of the European descendants, plantation owners, persons who may not look like me, and this might sound controversial, but it is very, it's a serious issue, where you'd find members of the historical society and so forth who, have a particular interest, a particular connection to the paper. They trust the archives, they know the role, because the archives is the place where their connections, their history, is made, right? Where their memories are kept, and they write their histories there. People like me, would say, looking like me, hey, that's not me. I am not there. Why should I trust you to represent me in that way? And so it depends on the territory. It depends on the activism of the Archivist-in-Charge. It depends on how vibrant the archives is. Now, in places like Jamaica, where the archives is, relegated to government, the National Library kind of play that community role, which is problematic, but let's not go there. But they see the National Library as the space, so they trust the library with, their community thing, their community memory and expressions, which is not necessarily a bad thing, all right? Let's keep it civil. But at the same time, the archive as a construct that is publicly known, is misunderstood easily. if all you can go, if every time there's a National Archives Day or National Heritage Day, the institution can only speak about slave registers, good grief. You know, persons like me don't need to be reminded every time that all you have are slave registers, right? All you have
and that in all this time, you really haven't done anything to equip yourself to handle other kinds of records as well, right? That doesn't necessarily engender any kind of trust also.
Yeah, and let's just be fair. I mean, equipping ourselves is really hard. We are government institutions. Government, you know, in terms of priorities, a new road versus boxes or versus programs. You know, I know national archivists who can't sleep because they can't keep the air conditioning on. Far less servants, you know, so it's a real struggle. And what we stress is get your community involved. Outreach is important. Let people know what you're doing. If they don't know what you're doing, they can't help, they can't participate, they can't give you, you know, stuff, can't give you contemporary materials. And so it's a real struggle. But now that we have our program, and let me be very fair, you know, I'm speaking to the community. Most of us did our training in the Commonwealth. Very few of us are American trained, and not knocking anybody because I'm Dundee trained, but if I was to apply my training rigidly, you know, so there's some materials I would not even consider as archival. I mean, my presentation, if I were, you know, if I were rigid in my training, you know, we would be talking about, you know, Caribbean issues in a different way. I mean, even the ways we consider archival information legislation, you know, quote unquote, right, we have best practices. And to tell the student best practices don't apply to us, our context is different, right? The best is really theirs, not ours. It is our responsibility to come up with our own realistic, quote unquote, best practice. And so those are issues we're trying to deal with. Those are some of the realities we're trying to cope with. And so now that we have a Caribbean archival studies which I'm pushing, hopefully it makes sense, you know, there is a way of doing archives, there's a way of doing memory in the Caribbean that chances are you would not be exposed to if you do your training elsewhere. So for those of us in the classroom, that's a reawakening. For those of my colleagues in the regional association, it's I've never thought of it that way. You know, it's a re-engineering of our thought processes, of our practice, and our ways of running the institution, or ways of participating in community.
That's right. Fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone. Please join me in extending another warm thank you to Dr. Stanley Griffin. I could talk to you all day, but we've gone over time, and I know that folks have other sessions to get to. So I just want to say thank you again for this wonderful, fantastic, and really moving talk. I think you know that these are topics that are close to my heart, as my roots are also in the Caribbean. And yeah, this was just really enlivening and a beautiful way to start my day. So much gratitude to you and to everyone for joining us. Yes, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you for having me. This was fun as I expected. All right, all the best.